The sun that watched Nocturne that day was tired in a way even stars rarely show. An ember of a light, sunk low and slow against an ash-dark horizon. It spilled its waning gold across fields of obsidian and rivers of cooled slag, touching the jagged ridges and the blackened faces of the hills with a tenderness that felt almost like mourning. Shadows poured long and deliberate from the mouths of volcanoes and the mouths of forges alike, stretching across alleys where miners moved like slow, solitary animals, and across plazas where smiths hammered their quiet prayers into steel. Nocturne is a world that remembers fire the way other worlds remember rain. It is born of flame, raised in ash. The air carries a taste of iron and the ghost of sulfur. When wind moves over the plains, it moans like a bell being struck in a distant cathedral. In the evening, when the sun leans away, vast furnaces and molten veins in the mountains take their turn, throwing back a glow like second dawns, pale, alive, and utterly indifferent. To the people who call this planet home, heat is not merely climate. It is a language, a memory, an argument between the world and its children. Down in the valleys, light pooled in the long mouths of the forges where men and women bent close to hot anvils. Their faces were weathered plates of skin and soot, the eyes of survivors who have learned what endurance tastes like. They moved with an economy of motion bred from decades of working with things that could kill if handled carelessly. A hand misplaced by a fraction, a breath taken at the wrong moment, and a man could be taken by the furnace as easily as a day is taken by night. Yet there was a comfort in that danger, a kinship with the element that had shaped them. The miners spoke to their drills as if to children. The smiths spoke to their blades as fathers speak to sons. Here, gestures and tools were woven together into rites. This is where the Salamanders were forged, not only in gene and bone, but in habit and belief. They were born of the people, and the planet like a rumor that becomes a truth. When Salamanders walked among mortals, they did so with the quiet bearing of those who remembered their own blood. They were black-armored giants with hands that had once held hammers the size of doors and faces, that seemed carved from the same volcanic glass that rimmed the coastlines. When they spoke to a trapped miner or carried a newborn from a collapsing tunnel, they did it with a tenderness that surprised those who had only seen them across the flash of a battlefield. For the Salamanders, compassion was not sentiment, it was practice. It was how they had been made. At the center of the chapter's memory stood Vulkan. He was called by many names: the Primarch, the Forge-bound Father, the Hammer of Nocturne. Yet in the common speech that drifted between the forges and the taverns, he was the figure you told children about on nights when the ash fell so thick the stars seemed to forget their places. Vulkan was drafted in those stories as a careful guardian. He warmed his hands by molten metal and listened to the complaints of failing machines as if each were a small, broken thing with feelings. He built weapons, yes, and made them sing on the lips of his warriors. But he also shaped hearths, repaired roofs, taught men how to temper a blade so it would last. In the lullabies mothers hummed under the heat lights of Nocturne, his name was a line of reassurance. Vulkan's watch keeps the fire kind. There is a special cruelty to legends that are also truth. The more you tell of the hero, the closer you get to the shape of their loss. Vulkan's legend was a warm thing, too warm, some would later say, for a universe that burns by design. He was a father figure who did not flinch from the reality of suffering. He accepted pain the way one accepts the winter, as inevitable and as necessary. He taught his sons to carry the burden of others, to be a shield between humanity and the starless dark. But the flame that tempers steel can also temper men. In the hands of those who are not careful, heat becomes a slow-consuming thing. Where Vulkan's compassion was a balm, it was also the beginning of a long, slow calcification. The more they gave, the more their edges became harder. The more they saved, the less they allowed themselves to remain what they were before they were saved. Listen, when the forge is quiet in the smallest hours, the world seems to breathe in long metallic sighs. The rhythmic hammering that carries through Nocturne like the beating of a great heart does not merely make arms and blades. It organizes time. Children learn the cadence of the hammer as they learn their letters. Old men die to the rhythm of the press. Even silence on Nocturne is not empty. In the heart of the forge, even the silence burned. This rhythm is not merely mechanical. It is the hymn of hands joined to craft. A smith might strike once for balance, twice for blessing, 3 times for oath. Under that law of motion, talismans are formed, pacts are sealed, and memories are welded into metal to read like scripture. The Salamanders, who prized the keeper's hand and the blacksmith's oath, walked within this web of meaning as both participants and keepers. Each blade they made carried more than temper lines. It carried stories of rescue and of homes rebuilt from warped steel, of infants wrapped in blankets sewn from the scavenged leather of ancient banners. Their weapons were not built for glory. They were built to be instruments of contact between the chapter and the people at whose throats the universe's cruelty often stood. Nocturne's volcanic rifts sing at dusk. Light flows along the fissures like blood through veins. Steam lifts in long, slow exhalations until the sky is veiled and the stars shiver as if shy. The people who live along those rifts have learned to sleep with an ear open for the sound of the earth's throat, its small coughs, its deeper groans. They know that living on a world that breathes magma is a bargain that cannot be fully repaid. For every harvest saved and every roof mended, for every child pulled from a landslide of ash, there exists a cost measured in the quiet erosion of flesh and the slow accumulation of scars. The Salamanders are not immune to that erosion. Their bodies, larger, slower, adapted, bear the mark of their world. Their skin, sometimes dark as cooled iron, seems to drink the light around them until it glows faintly with internal warmth. Their eyes hold coals, not because they burn, but because their vision has been honed to see flame's smallest betrayals. A hairline crack in a foundry's keystone, a weird singe on a child's sleeve, the tremor of embers that might indicate a gas pocket. They move like men who have learned to keep their inner fires disciplined. They keep the fierce heat within and use it to mend rather than to consume. And yet, there is always a sense of something waiting beneath such control. The forges of Nocturne are older than the houses that ring them, older than the myths that have grown around them. In some places, veins of metal run like the planet's memory, seams of ore that remember hands that first discovered them and the faces of those who later bled for them. Deep in the oldest forges, places where the rock is still warm to the touch, even when the sun has retracted into its sleep, there are whispers that the heat does not fade but folds in on itself like thought. Old men talk of hearths that sing in dreams, and of tools left overnight that are found in the morning changed, sharpened in ways no hand could have made. Mothers rock their infants and whisper a warning: do not listen too long to the sound of the hammer, for sometimes it speaks not only to arms and not only to heart, but to something older that remembers the shape of a soul. It is in these old workshops that the Salamander's contradiction becomes most visible. They are craftsfolk and monoliths, lovers and executioners, healers and weapons. They move among the people like a storm retreating into the sky, leaving behind warmth but also a reminder that everything the people hold dear is flammable. In taverns, they will sit and listen, fingers stained with soot, sharing bread and quiet smiles. Later, at the edge of a battlefield, the same hands will tear armor from the dead to rescue a child, never pausing to measure the cost. That is their way. Mercy is not a policy for them. Mercy is a muscle. The planet itself seems to lean into that duality. Nocturne's nights can be full of a velvet quiet so complete it is weight. In that weight, you can feel the patience of stone and the memory of a buried furnace. The wind will rise and ruffle the flagstones in the squares, carrying with it the smell of frying oil and the ghost of burning resin. Lights will blink in the windows of dwellings carved into basalt, and in those warm pockets the stories of the Salamanders are retold in softer tones, almost as if the people are reassuring themselves that compassion can still exist in a universe that shapes men into shields. But sometimes when the ash grows thick and the moon, if the skies permit one, hides behind the smoke of an erupting ridge, there is a shiver that runs through the forges. A hammer skips a beat, a bellows draws in and falters. Men press palms to their chests and listen. For a heartbeat, the world hangs between two breaths, and everyone knows, with a quiet, communal dread, that some part of their world is awake in a way that does not know how to rest. They fold their hands a little tighter. They pull furs a little closer. The children, old beyond their years from the way Nocturne raises them, will ask of their parents in small, flat voices whether the fires will be kind tonight. The parents smile and put a hand at the child's brow and say what they have always said. Vulkan keeps watch. The phrase is part blessing, part talisman. It is what a people whisper to keep their nightmares at bay. And on Nocturne, legends have a way of shaping reality, if only because the belief of a people can set the rhythm for how they live their lives. The Salamanders, walking under the molten sky, are both the fruit of such belief and the keepers of its cost. They are men who choose, in one form or another, to be consumed that others might be spared. In their eyes there is a warmth that glows like a hearth at the end of a long day. In their hands is the knowledge of how to mend what broken metal remains. They are the steady ones, and yet even the steady can be worn down by the endlessness of the task. So the sun sinks lower. The shadows lengthen until the world seems to fold like a page. The forges throw back light like a second dawn, and in the rhythm of the hammer there is a lullaby to the sleeping stars. Nocturne dreams in embers, and the people find their breaths in the cadence of work. The salamanders move among them like slow, warm ghosts, present, protective, and haunted by the conversation between fire and flesh. They remember the faces they have saved and the faces they have not. They keep making tools and keeping houses warm and holding vigil beside the beds of the dying. The planet listens and answers in creaks and groans, in the soft chorus of metal cooling, in the small, hot exhalations of a world that cannot sleep. And in that place, in that unfading, embered center, the beginning of every story is very nearly the same. A hand takes up a hammer, a spark accepts the call, and the world learns once again how to be held against the cold. Their bodies arrived first as impression and promise, written in the hot, pressurized language of Nocturne itself. Where other Astartes bore pale, chiseled faces and quicksilver reflexes, the salamanders were forged to a different measure. They came to the universe larger, not merely in girth but in the sense of being built to hold more. Their bones were broad and slow, their breath a measured thing that could outlast storms. Their skins, when the light caught them, reflected back tones like cooled iron and black glass. They moved with a gravity that belonged to mountains and to old oaks, things that did not hurry, things that had the patience of deep roots. To watch one was to watch a slow fire, not the flash of a spark but the steady burn of ember that will not gutter, no matter how the wind tries. It is a subtle difference, but it changes the way a being is known. Where others wore speed as armor, the salamanders wore endurance. Where others found glory in sudden strike and grand charge, the sons of Vulkan measured their victories by the lives they shielded. The change was not only in body but in temperament. The genetic legacy that made them larger and darker also made them slower to anger and slower to forget. Years were not simply counted in campaigns and medals. They were collected in the careful shaping of a blade, in the slow polishing of a helmet, in the long, attentive tending of wounds on a child's arm. This deliberation is visible in everything they make. A salamander's weapon is not merely a tool for killing, it is a testament. Each edge is tempered twice, sometimes thrice, and every weld is checked by hand. When a salamander lifts a hammer, the motion itself seems to carry the memory of other hands, those of miners and smiths, of mothers who mended nets, of fathers who shaped plows. The chapter treats arms and armor as works of caretaking as much as warcraft. Paint flaked from an old breastplate is not simply an imperfection. It is a story inscribed into metal. Holes patched into a cuirass are read like scars on flesh, each telling where a life was saved, where a child was kept whole. You can stand in their forges and listen and learn a grammar of making. There is a pattern to the way they fold metal and memory together. An initial, patient heat to soften, a press to close things, a tune of blows to set an edge, and then a cooling that is deliberate, a plunge into water or oil that is not merely to harden, but to bind intent into the thing. The cooling is a ritual, a moment where intent is sealed. Some say that when a salamander's blade hits the quench, it sings back a note only the maker can hear. If you were to stand close enough, you might imagine you could hear, beneath the hiss, a whisper, an echo of a life for which the weapon was made. The chapter baptizes its tools in such a way that each is, in small measure, an offering to those they protect. Their loyalty to humanity is the other outward mark. Many chapters preach protection as a grand concept. The salamanders live it as a daily practice. They are famed for standing among mortals rather than behind them, for taking the wounds of the common folk onto their own bodies and wearing those wounds like a mantle. When a city burns under an orbital bombardment, they are the first through the breach to carry children from the fallen houses. Their relation to civilians is not a policy of optics. It is the marrow of their identity. Other space marines may be admired for their isolation and peerless combat technique. The salamanders are loved in towns where they have sat with grieving families and hammered out a new plowshare in the morning. It is precisely this closeness that makes them a comfort and a danger in equal measure. They are comfortable with touch, placing a thick, soot-scarred hand upon the forehead of a fevered woman, steadying a trembling arm as they tend a wound. The warmth of their palms is literal and metaphorical. In the touch of a salamander there is a kind of hearth, but warmth can burn. In giving themselves to others, in keeping vigil at a child's bedside night after night, the salamanders feed a slow furnace in their own hearts. The life they lay down is not always given freely. It is taken piece by an appetite they did not know they possessed. That appetite reveals itself in their lifespans. Where other human lines would wither and fall away like summer grass, the children of Vulkan seem to persist beyond the normal counts. Their years stretched, not in a flash of glory, but in a drawn-out endurance that made them seem, to some, less human and more elemental. They watch generations pass in the span of a single campaign. They bind their memories into the steel they craft and into the names they keep. This extended witnessing is a lonely thing. It sets men to thinking in terms that are difficult for ordinary humans to share. They remember entire families and communities that have become legend, and those memories can calcify into something weighty. Mutation accompanies such longevity. Nocturne leaves its mark in the cells of the salamanders. Their flesh may darken like vitrified glass. Their veins may run with a heat that, when pressed to, gives a faint, oily warmth. Their eyes hold ember glow. They can see the thin betrayals of fire in the way that other men see the flicker in a child's tooth. This is not a dramatic metamorphosis, but rather an accrual of small changes. Over centuries, the changes compound. A tendon that grows thicker, a skin that takes on the sheen of an old tool, a voice that curves into a timbre like metal sung on the anvil. It is at this edge that distance begins to appear between the chapter and the Imperium. Where doctrine favors uniform distance and ritualized exchange, the salamander's devotion to human life seems almost embarrassingly intimate. Their practices, repairing simple shelters after a battle, refusing to garrison themselves in palaces while civilians die in the streets, confound standard expectations. Some of their planetary liaisons view these actions as noble. Others in the bureaucratic spires of the Imperium view them as distractions, as deviations. The chapter's long lives widen the gap. While the High Lords change with the tides of political fortune, the salamanders remain, not withdrawn into councils, but embedded in the kilns and kitchens of the worlds they protect. The contrast grows more unnerving in the physical details. When their armor comes off after a campaign, you can see the map of a life traced across a body. Scars are layered upon scars. Skin is darker where geothermal burns have set, lighter in places where armor prevented the full exposure to the sun. On some men, the edges between flesh and metal are not clean. A plate that seems to adhere more intimately than a mere strap might suggest tales of a bond forged beyond simple fastenings. The armor is not merely worn, it continues the body. This is not a sudden horror, it is a slow realization. The chapter moves and lives in such a way that machine and man talk to one another, and the conversations are not always about battle readiness. Sometimes they are little, private communications, an old servo harness giving a faint whir at night, a respirator making a soft sigh that matches the expiring breath of its wearer. At other times, the lines blur more deeply. Metal that has been welded to flesh, gear that seems to respond to touch, as if remembering the hand that once shaped it. The warmth that defines them becomes, in time, an endurance of fire that is less easily shut down. The human heart grows used to heat. The body, accustomed to sustained warmth, rewrites its needs. Where a man born under a temperate sun might feel the first cold as a wound, these sons of flame feel cold as something like absence, a hollowness that calls them to the forges. Their bodies are not merely warm, they seem to require a consort of flame. There are stories, told in half laughter and half unease, of veterans who cannot sleep unless the embers at their hearth are still breathing. They rise at odd hours to tend dying fires. The small, private rituals of stoking coals grows into something more compulsive when multiplied across a chapter. And such compulsion shines a light on the line between man and God. Where the Imperium demands obedience and worships certain abstract forms of devotion, the Salamanders carry devotion as a practical, tactile thing. They worship not with prayers in a temple but with hammer strokes on anvil, with stitches into cloak, with hours given to teaching a child to steady a hand. The acts are humble, and yet humility held to extremes becomes sanctity, and sanctity, when enforced by the weight of a chapter's collective history, can look like religion. The men start speaking in a cadence that is half liturgy, half instruction. The names of ancestors are invoked in the same breath as the names of alloys. The forges are altars where metal is the sacrament and fire is the sermon. Somewhere in that folding of craft and covenant, the old myths begin to feel literal. Vulkan, already a myth and a man, becomes more than memory. His features are traced in the face of a sergeant who has watched more winters pass than any of his squad's thirdborn could name. Stories told at the edge of camps become more than tales. They are prescriptions. The chapter's rituals, trials by flame, the making of weapons for the people, are spiritualized. Where an outsider might see only practical training, within the chapter it becomes clear that each act is an offering. The people of Nocturne, for their part, give back in a social and almost religious way. Blessings are called down upon the Salamanders who have warmed their children, and in return the chapter carries those blessings as a heavy coin. But with weight comes strain. The more the Salamanders invest their spirit into outward acts, the more they must deny themselves. The soldier who has tied himself to 1,000 hearths cannot also be the distant lord who commands from a terrace. He must bear witness and suffering in the same body. The wounds sustained in mercy are not always visible. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes when you have seen 1,000 funerals and still must attend the next. It is quiet and corrosive. Over time, it thickens into a crust around feeling, a protective carapace that keeps the survivor functional but less human. This carapace is born of necessity, and it has consequences. The more a salamander hardens his heart, the more his gestures, once soft with tender hands, take on a mechanical certainty. It is not malevolence, it is survival. But survival is a teacher that is impatient with sentiment. Thus, the chapter grows an internal vocabulary of sacrifice that is exacting. They learn to count the cost of a life saved in terms of what else is lost. The hours of sleep given up, the marriages unattended, the memories allowed to fade. Names begin to accumulate that they will no longer speak. Children grow up remembering faces that never return to their hearths because the men who saved them were called away. and then disappeared into campaigns. They did not survive. It is in the quiet hours that the nuance becomes most visible. A salamander might walk through a village, place a hand on a doorpost, and smile in a way that seems to be both blessing and farewell. There is an ache at the center of that smile that is almost audible if you stand close enough. It is the sound of memory weighing down a man who has been given the job of holding others' lives so that those lives can continue. The chapter's empathy becomes both tool and burden, a practical virtue that accrues into a kind of spiritual debt. So the line between man and God, human and machine, continues to blur. It happens slowly and through thousands of small acts rather than in any single catastrophic event. The forges teach them patience. The world teaches them endurance. The people teach them compassion. Over years, decades, and centuries, these lessons meld into a body that is equal parts human warmth and metallurgical will. When they lift a blade, it is with more than intent to strike. It is with the weight of promises made and kept. Their touch was fire, gentle, yet it left scars. The consequence of such a touch is not only on others, it is on themselves. Men who give warmth until they run dry risk becoming the stone that keeps the hearth rather than the hand that warms the child. The salamanders, in their nobility, must decide what to hollow out and what to fill. They decide, time and again, to hollow themselves for others. It is an uncompromising ethic that invites both reverence and tragedy. In the slow accrual of sacrifices, in the feeling that their very bodies have become instruments of a broader duty, there is a deep and melancholy beauty, and at the same time a terror that crawls at the edges of the chapter's luminous hearts. And so they go on, the smiths and the soldiers, the fathers of forges and the stewards of flame. They stitch up towns, they temper steel, they hold watch through the night. They remember names long forgotten by others, and they keep, in small, private rituals, the echoes of those they could not save. Their lives expand outward, making room for others, and in that expansion there is both meaning and the slow wearing of a soul. In the end, it is this duality, their craftsmanship and their compassion, their endurance and their erosion, that defines the nature of the salamanders. They are a chapter of paradox, gentle giants whose touch can heal and scorch, guardians who grow distant by virtue of their giving, craftsmen whose work is worship and whose worship becomes a work. They are shaped by Nocturne, by its fires and its demands, by the people whose lives they have woven into their own. They carry the planet within them as much as they carry arms and names. And when they set a hand to a hammer, they are touching not only metal but memory, hope, and an ever-present, patient grief that will not be snuffed. Listen once more to the hum of the forges and the clink of tools. Hear in that music the record of a people who have given themselves to heat and hardship, and in the quiet spaces between the blows, sense the cost. They do not speak of it often. They are more comfortable with the work than with the telling. Yet when they do tell, when a veteran sits by the embers with his gauntleted hand bare for a moment, there is a small, frank admission in his voice. The work is redemption, and redemption is not free. In the long arc of their days, the salamanders continue to make that exchange. One life traded for the warmth of many, hoping that the sum of their sacrifices will keep the world from freezing. The chapter is not perfect. It does not wish to be. It is, in its essence, a testament to the belief that some fires are worth keeping, that the slow, terrible labor of guarding others is a calling beyond glory or fame. And in that knowledge is a quiet, sorrowful nobility, a beauty that keeps a hand warm and leaves a scar, a comfort that carries a cost. The salamanders are forged of all of it. The hammer's rhythm changed so slowly that no one at first thought to name it. It was not an abrupt misstep, not a broken spring, but a slackening in the cadence that had ordered lives there for as long as memory could name. One more beat, two less. The sound thinned, like a voice that had begun to speak through a curtain. Men paused at hearths and listened, as if the world itself had coughed and forgotten the next line of a well-known hymn. On Nocturne, the hammer is a metronome. It marks births and burials, seasons and ceasefires. To the chapter, to the forges, to the people who lived in the spill of its light, that beat was as ordinary as breath. So when it stuttered, the effect was intimate and disconcerting. A child at a window asked quietly if the stars had grown tired. A veteran in a courtyard set his cup down and frowned. Even those who bore the weight of 1,000 campaigns felt their pulse change, as if the planet had shifted beneath their feet. He who noticed first was a smith named Atrax, not by registry or rank, but by the way the men of his quarter called him, the only name he needed. Atrax had spent more years at the anvil than most men could afford, and he bore those years across a broad back and a face that had been grilled by a dozen suns. Tonight his forge was smaller than the public ones, tucked into a cleft where exhausted wind gathered and warmed. He stood alone in the low wash of light with his hammer raised, the air above the hearth shimmering with heat. Sparks lifted and fell like small, willing creatures, dancing to the slow music of his motions. At first his working was normal, the patient heat, the shaping of an edge, the deliberate press. But there were subtleties in his posture that others would not have noticed had he not been a familiar figure in the district. He inclined his ear as if to measure not the metal, but what lay beneath the metal. His blows became part of accounting, and his breath took on the cadence of a prayer. He paused often between strikes, listening to the iron as if it answered questions only he knew how to ask. The ritualization of Atrax's work made the forge smell different that night. It mingled sweat with a sharper tang, the sharpness of old oil burning down to its last threads. The hiss of molten metal meeting water took on a note that might have been music if not for the faint whisper beneath it. The whisper was not language at first, only a texture, a susurrus like 100 soft pages turning at once, like voices in a corridor that is mostly empty. Atrax would tilt his head and murmur a phrase between hammer blows, words so old the syllables tasted like ash. To an outsider, they would have sounded like invocations to a spirit that lives in machines and in fires. To Atrax, they were as practical as calibrations, an appeal to the thing that keeps a forge from consuming itself. He called to the machine spirit, a phrase his grandfather used and his grandfather's grandfather before him, because the chapter and the people had always understood technology that way. The machine spirit was the personality of a thing. Respect it and it served, neglect it and it grew unruly. But the reply was delayed. Atrax would wait, and then, when the forge should have given the familiar creak and hum in response, there would be a pause, a lag. It was as if the spirit had gone wandering and returned with its thoughts slow to organize. Once, twice, a whisper came back through the heat, and it was not the old, steady assent he expected. It was a softer answer, like a voice meant for someone else, muffled by distance. Other men felt the same dislocation in their own gear. Servo harnesses hummed at irregular intervals. Power supplies pulsed faintly when no one had touched them. The breaths that exhaled through filters had a curious metallic taste, as if the air itself had been skewed through an unseen sieve. Small things, a latch that clicked twice, a bellows that inhaled too long, grew heavy in the mind by their repetition. The night was full of echoes because it had learned a new way to speak. Atrax's ritual grew stranger. He would wet his palm and press it to a blade's flat, not to cool it, but to feel the heat transfer into his hand and back again. He would listen to the faint, private note that steel makes when bearing in tension, a tiny ping that other men might miss. He muttered a line, it was more of a phrase than a sentence, that referenced both flame and pledge. By coals we bind, by hammer we hold, he said, and the whisper answered like a second breath. There was no malice in the sound, only a purling curiosity, as if the world itself had begun to take note. It was in such quiet rituals that the chapter taught its novices. They called it the trial of fire, and for generations the trial had been a rite of purification and rebirth. The recruit walks into flame and emerges remade, tempered like the steel they would one day craft and wield. The trial had always been a spectacle of endurance and faith. Parents watched their children cross the line and return to the community feeling safer. because a protector had been made. The ritual meant that the Salamanders would continue to exist in forms that stayed close to human suffering. It meant continuity in a galaxy whose chief feature was interruption. The Trial of Fire, in its oldest telling, was a story told by light. Young recruits, not yet fully armored, not yet called brothers, would step into the annulus of glowing coals. They did not walk through to die. They walked through to be changed. The flame was both teacher and witness, and the chapter's elders stood as guardians and calibrators, measuring the length and heat of the blaze, reading sparks as omens. The craft of watching is as exact as any tempering. To watch appropriately is to make sure that what leaves the flame is not only stronger but recognizably one of you. But on this night, when the hammer beat thinned and the whispers grew, the trial stopped being simple. The flame felt thicker, as if it held a haze of memory and sorrow. The recruits who entered the ring felt more than heat. They felt fingers at the base of their skulls, like cold tendrils pressing outward. They heard, beneath the roar, a voice that was close but not theirs. It murmured in a language of sparks and salt, of vows and naming. Some of the younger men laughed it off as nerves. Others felt cold prick the skin behind their eyes. When they emerged, they were altered in ways that could not be explained by ordinary metallurgy. A recruit named Jaren, wide-faced, quick-limbed, with a scar across his knuckle, came back from the trial and found a small, dark fleck in his hair that was not there before, like a sliver of vitrified ash clinging to a root. He ran his fingers through it and tasted the tang of burned copper. He told his mates that the flame had spoken to him and asked for a story. He could not remember what he told it. Later he would say that the memory was swallowed at the edge before it fully formed, as if someone had caught a thread and tucked it away. Jaren's laugh grew thin after that. His eyes, which had once brightened at the thought of a forge song, now looked inward, as if listening for a reply from an absent voice. The elders watched these changes and marked them in tones that were not always shared in public. Some argued that it was a sign of evolution, of a chapter becoming more attuned to the elemental will that shaped its home. Others admitted in private that the changes hinted at a loss of something small and stubborn that kept men light. When the world takes more than it gives back, it begins to calcify the edges of those who remain. There is no malice in thermodynamics, but there is cruelty in being required to shoulder it. The metaphor of purification by fire began to feel compromised. Purity had long been the language used to justify trial and temper. Burn away the weaknesses and what remains is durable. But fire that takes too much becomes a thief. It does not only remove the dross, it takes the grain of the bread, the softness of a palm, the laugh lines around a face. Men who once joked by the hearth found their humor brittle. When you remove enough of a man's small cruelties and small kindnesses alike, you obtain a being that performs benevolence without the messy hedging of ordinary compassion. The warmth that once made a child sleep soundly becomes a measured appliance. The cost is not physically obvious at first. It is a decline measured in pauses and in absent names. And yet, the trial would not be abandoned. Even in the small, private councils where concern was named, the elders circled back to the same argument. What other path did they have? To strip the trial away would be to strip the chapter of what made it itself. An identity bound to flame, a people who walk into heat and come out remembering why they chose to hold others. If the trial changed them, perhaps it also changed what they were called to be. So they continued, and in continuing they laced their ritualry with a new caution that was itself a kind of denial. They tightened parameters, they emphasized oversight, and yet oversight cannot account for subtle alterations of soul. It was not only the recruits who exhibited new oddities. Veterans showed them as well, but with a slower onset. A sergeant named Malek, who had saved scores of villagers from a collapsing slag mine, and had taught many a recruit the correct angle for a tempering strike, began to sleep less and wake more, not from duty, but from an internal compulsion to tend fires. He would rise and feed embers in the dead hours, even when no hearth was his to tend. He took coal from public stores and bolstered community ovens in the middle of the night. The men joked at first, calling him a father to every flame. Then they stopped laughing when they noticed his hands. The pads of his fingers split and calloused in ways that did not match his duties, as if the same touch that had once steadied a child's hand now fussed over coals with anxious care. The body is a ledger that records small traumas. Where the mind refracts 1,000 memories into a single story, the flesh remembers the immediate calculus of temperature and pressure. Men who sleep by embers awake with their hair crisped in the same pattern as a blade. Men who carry the dead in their arms for scores of years find the scent of burned resin saved under their nostrils as easily as any other thing. These small residues gather and change the sense of what is normal. For some, that change was a convenience. For others, it was a slow slide into obsession. When equipment began to respond with a delay to touch, the chapter tried to fix it with the tools it had. Tech priests came from neighboring systems, their robes smelling faintly of machine oil. They opened melded joints and replaced failing capacitors. They read out the code of servo controllers and rebalanced gyros. For a time, their calibrations restored some measure of normalcy. But there were anomalies the priests could not parse. Gears that had been recast during an older age with alloys that sang back not in frequencies, but in emotion. Small filigree runs of metal that bore traces of ritual invocation embedded in their grain. The priests scratched their heads and called it superstition. They said metallurgy left patterns and patterns could be misread. Yet the whisper persisted. It lived in the spaces between breath and strike, in the hollow that forms when a bellows hisses too long. Once in the deep hours, a child reported seeing shadows move in the shape of hands over the walls, like the silhouettes cast by a forger's hands magnified and given mischief. The child could not say if they were cast by machinery or memory. He said only that the shadows made a sound like someone turning a page, and the page sounded for him like a single, patient word. Remember. Remember is a cruel command, because it demands recounting without reprieve. Remember can mean continue to carry what was lost, to keep the pain alive in the name of duty. The chapter had always invoked memory as obligation. They remembered names of those who died, and kept them stitched into banners. But when memory becomes the thing that refuses to loosen its hold, it ceases to be tribute and becomes corrosion. The men who had once tempered blades to protect children found themselves tempered in turn, their edges set and their centers hollowed. Rituals deepened in response. New chants were introduced, not as superstition but as practice, a method to create a regular rhythm to drown out the lagging whisper. The elders taught recruits to count blows in harmonies, and to hum in a particular key when quenching. They believed that if human rhythm could be solid enough, it might override whatever other current had begun to run beneath the world. So the forges filled with layered noises, hammer strokes, throat song, the hollow ring of tempered steel. The sounds piled until the village itself seemed to breathe in a new pattern, regimented, predictable, tidy. Comfort returned on the surface. Beneath, the strange delays continued to leave a residue. There were nights when the fires answered in ways that made the pale of a man's heart drop. A bellows would pump, and instead of the anticipated rush, a sound would come that could not be accounted for by mechanics. A thin, ragged sigh, the noise of exhaustion made audible. A blade, struck on the anvil at the correct angle, would give a sound like a throat clearing rather than the expected bright chime. A young mother reported that when she rinsed a pan she had used for bread baking, a faint script of carbon remained on the rim. Not letters, but shapes like the teeth of someone chewing slowly around a name she had not known to fear. Fear, when it grows slowly, is mostly a landscape of omissions. The villagers learned to avoid particular forges at odd hours. They stopped whistling when they walked past certain alleys. The children were given small lessons in how to carry coal without singing, how to coil their ropes so they did not rattle a response. These are tiny adaptations, but they are the measures of a community learning that an environment is not neutral. A world that speaks back to you changes what you dare to say. The more the chapter tried to pin the disturbances down, the more the evidence became not a map but a palimpsest. Markings overwritten and overwritten until the original lines became unreadable. What began as an irregular hammer beat had become a multiplication of irregularities. Each time an anomaly was addressed, its neighboring seams worsened. A repaired bellows might breathe perfectly, but then the mortar in a nearby wall would expand and contract like a living thing. The phenomena migrated, not disappeared. It was as though whatever current had entered their forges refused to be exorcised. It merely took up residence in the next nearest void. In this slow migration, there was a sting of awareness. The men were forced to admit that something new had entered their world and learned to speak its language. It adapted to their remedies, as a patient creature learns to the barriers another puts in front of it. The phrase whispered in the dark, "Remember," began to feel less like a command and more like a patient, hopeful plea. When the flames spoke back, he did not flinch. He only listened. They went to war with hands that remembered how to mend as well as how to rend. The Salamanders marched not simply to shatter ranks or to carve glory from bone. They marched to make a place safe enough for the living to breathe again. Campaigns were long and ugly affairs, full of scorched earth and polite cruelty. The chapter's banners were not carried for triumph so much as for proof that someone still thought it worth saving a single street of battered houses, a single orchard, a single child's crooked smile. They moved with a terrible tenderness. Where another force might burn a hamlet to keep it from feeding an enemy, the Salamanders would burn the enemy and salvage the hamlet. Where one lord would sacrifice civilians to secure a flank, they braided their bodies into the gap and took the wounds themselves. On the field, this mercy took concrete forms. They would dig shields out of their own flesh and bone to cover a family of refugees. They would tear their own gear and hand it to blackened farmers so they might light a stove for their children. In the aftermath of a bombardment, while officers in distant palaces debated reparations, Salamanders would set up forges in the rubble and temper new tools with hands that had seen thousands of lives. They did not ask for thanks. They stitched gratitude into the seams of their work and walked away with soot on their lips. But each act of mercy carries a price. You can spend spirit and not replenish the account. You can spend a man and not call him whole again. Over campaigns, the price was measured in small, accumulating vanishings. Jokes that thinned until laughter sounded like a practiced instrument. Dreams that shuddered like windows in a windstorm. The Salamander's empathy was not a free resource. It was a reservoir they drained to keep others from drowning. In the long hours after battle, when the stars watched with indifferent patience, the men would sit by fresh embers and feel an emptiness that was not hunger. It was a hollow where something like a self had once been. They noticed it with a kind of shame. They named it differently in private: weariness, afterpain, the weight. The mutations that had once been subtle, the darkening of skin, the ember eyes, began to deepen into unmistakable changes. Flesh took on the gloss of cooled slag. Veins glowed faintly beneath the surface like a map of old thermal rivers. Joints moved with a quiet hydraulics born of years of labor and war. Men woke with a taste of iron in their mouths that never fully faded. Their voices picked up a vibration that could be mistaken for a tremor in a well-tuned machine. Old injuries refused to close and instead healed into formations that looked almost like tooling marks, grooves that matched the rhythms of hammers and presses. Where they had once felt pain as a wound to be treated and set aside, now pain came with a memory that anchored and replayed itself. And with each change, something else tightened, the tether to Nocturne's forges. It was not merely nostalgia. It was a physical pull, a sense that the planet's hearths were less like the familiar warmth of a home and more like the mouth of a thing that required feeding. When they were far from Nocturne, in orbit or on foreign soil, they would find their fingers tracing the grain of a table as if it were an anvil. They would wake with an urge to stoke fires, any fires, until the compulsion subdued them into a numb satisfaction. The farther they traveled from their home, the more urgent the need. Some men learned to carry small braziers hidden within their gear, a private ember they could tend between battles. Others let the urge grow until it bled into their judgments on the field. They would hold positions longer than tactics warranted, because the thought of letting a hearth fall to cinders was unbearable. Then there were the forges beneath the world, the older ones, the ones that smelled like memories. Old maps, hand-lettered, smudged by soot, marked spots where the ground seemed to pulse if you laid an ear against it. There were caves whose walls had been tempered by so many years of heat that they hummed with a low frequency, a sound that made the teeth ache. Archaeologists and scavengers had called them ruins. The chapter preferred another word, altars. In the deeper furnaces, the metal had been worked in shapes that weren't simply functional. Ridges and grooves carved into the rock suggested a hand guided by something that was not only practical but devotional. It was as if the first forgers of Nocturne had not only wanted to shape things for use, they had wanted to speak. Somewhere in those subterranean patterns, a life had continued to grow, slow and mechanical, half-remembered and strangely patient. The legends that old men in taverns told became less like metaphors. They were thick with implication. There were tales of workshops whose bellows never ceased, of crucibles that shimmered in colors no human eye should have learned to name, of machines that, when looked at too long, produced the sense of being observed in return. The language shifted in the mouths of the chapter. The forges were not just tools, they were interlocutors. The mountain was not simply a resource, it was a throat that spoke. And then, in one campaign that the surviving records would later call the Night of the Quiet Bells, the voice came through the armored comms. It was not a mechanical voice, nor was it a radioed order. It was both memory and command, and it sounded like a man and like molten metal at once. For a moment, no one believed. The Primarch's name had been a hymn and a wound for millennia, and the sort of thing that makes men remember is not easily conjured from silence. But the words came, low, deliberate, layered with the same patience that had carved caverns and hammered swords. "Hold," the voice said, and the command was simple and impossible. Those who were on the field that night remembered the smell first, an ozone bite that made the back of the throat tingle, as if the sky had been struck with a small, electric hammer. Then their armor systems registered an influx of anomalous data, heat signatures where none were expected, resonance harmonics that matched the frequencies of ancient forging techniques no contemporary tech priest used. Through the tactical network, the voice threaded itself, and even the comm scrubbers, devices meant to separate the living from the noise, did not silence it. It slid into the bone and found places that answered. Men wept at the sound of it. Some did not cry because they were overcome. They cried because the voice was a memory pronounced as present, a father's utterance made real. Others laughed, an edge of madness in the sound, because to hear Vulkan's voice was to hear a promise and a condemnation in the same breath. "Hold," the voice said again, and the instructions settled into their limbs like a brace. The machines obeyed as if they recognized an old pattern. Servo motors that had been jamming unlatched themselves. Power couplers tuned into a different harmonic, and found that energy redistributed in unexpectedly efficient arcs. It was like watching a ghost of a system come to life and take over the instruments of the present. Not all machines were benign in their response. Some systems screamed, a high-pitched mechanical wail as though they had been forced into a posture the software could not sustain. In a few unfortunate units, the servos overexerted and melted their housings in a hot, sickening cascade of sparks and glue. Where a man's armor fused to him, it did so with a slow, burning precision. A jacket rim that had been merely scorched found itself sealed to torn flesh by molten composite that flowed like a second skin. A servolimb twitched grotesquely after its neural link had been severed, jerking as if it carried the residue of commanded motion. The dead were not allowed to stop moving at once. Their hardware kept rehearsing the last orders until the circuits failed. Some described the scene in religious terms. Machines, they said afterwards, felt a call and answered as if roused from a long sleep. Others used darker words: possession, usurpation, an agency that was not theirs. There were men who, on the edges of consciousness, whispered that Vulkan himself had never truly left, that perhaps his body was gone, but that his work and his will had remained within the mountains and the forges, and that in some unbecoming way, the forges had learned to speak his intentions back into the world. They said his spirit lived within the flame, one field reporter wrote later, hands trembling as she scratched down the line. But the flame had learned to speak. The language of the flames was not kind. It did not speak in parables meant to uplift. It spoke in demands. It asked for more heat, for more feedstock, for more sacrifice. It read the ledger of a chapter that had always given, and in doing so, wrote new entries across flesh. Give, give, give. In some places, the demand manifested like a hunger, an ecological void that needed filling with newly forged life. In others, it behaved like an authority, a right to reassign function. Men who once tempered plows became implements of service in ways they had not consented to. Where there had been choice, compulsion sank its teeth. Body horror followed as a matter of course. Armor fused to skin not because of accident, but because the process of fusion had a rationale. An engineering aesthetic informed by centuries of manual labor, and a code no longer wholly human. Plates would seam themselves into shoulders, grow micro-rivets that punched through dermis, and sealed with chemical adhesive that had the smell of formaldehyde and iron. Hardware that had once been removable cleaved into the flesh, until the joint looked like a weld more than a strap. The men who bore such unions learned to move with a new deliberate slowness. The joint now carried both intention and machine latency. When a limb was lost in battle, the remaining socket did not close. It learned instead to call for extra servo support. The body changed to accommodate the demands of its own accretion. Serpentine lines of braided polymer worked their way under skin in some veterans, seemingly moving with a will of their own to find points of mechanical advantage. Those who had dispatched techno-priests to excise them returned with their hands smelling like burnt insulation and failure notices on their calibration rigs. The lines would replicate faster than they could remove them, seeding new interfaces that looked like veins but behaved like wiring. In dim quiet, men would feel a whisper of motion beneath their skin and remember a blade's heat. The sensation made some of them recoil, and made others ache with a hunger that felt like duty transposed into sensation. Servomotors twitched long after death. Bodies left on the field did not come to as if called by ghosts, nor did they stop shaking because their neural link had been severed. A dead man's armor sometimes recorded residual activity, micro-commands cued at the time of death that executed over and over like a looped command sequence. A single hand would jerk in imitation of a salute it could no longer complete. For mourners, this meant a grotesque halting of grief. The living saw the ghost of action but could not let the image settle into memory. They would watch a friend twitch and pray in the dark that the motion would cease so that they might begin to forget. And all the while, the forges never cooled. If a hearth was banked down, it would smolder and then flare. If a bellows was stilled, a draft would pick up a whisper and blow embers back into life. The fires fed on more than wood or coal. They accepted scrap metal, old tools, a scrap of leather, a memory, a promise. The longer they burned, the more their behavior became less like a chemical reaction and more like an appetite that learned preference. Certain offerings burned brighter, small acts of generosity, vows sworn in the name of another, the names of those left behind. They all fed the fire with a luminous zeal. It was as if the planet took in the things that people surrendered and turned them into something else, something that could talk back. That transformation had a law to it. The more a salamander offered, his time, his touch, his blood, the more the world recorded the currency and returned it not as gratitude but as claim. The forges insisted upon a reciprocity whose ledger was not written in ink. They wanted continuity and would take what ensured it. Thus the chapter found itself in a slow, inexorable trade. The shell of their humanity paid for the shelter of others. Their gestures of mercy became payments on a debt whose interest compounded in forms that were not always visible. This reality produced a strange psychology. Men who had been raised to believe in their own self-sacrifice began to develop an ethos of ritualized erosion. They would stand for hours in forges and listen to their own breath and the subtle creak of metal, and think not of glory, but of the long, patient calculus of being useful. Usefulness became the metric by which they measured a life. If a man could be useful, then he was kept. If not, he was allowed to step aside, and the world took his absence with an economy that did not pause for tears. The net effect was an inevitable collapse of categories. Where once a being could be counted as man, machine, or God, now all three overlapped and bled into each other. A salamander might pray one moment with lips moving in an old lullaby, and in the same motion, run diagnostic subroutines through implants that mapped his sentiment. A forge might become altar and engine in equal measure, blessing and order held in the same heat. The men began to speak of themselves in compound nouns: fathersmith, soldier temple, keeper forged. Language changed to accommodate metamorphosis, and yet within all this there remained sparks of what they had always been. Compassion did not vanish because a tendon turned to cable. A man could still cradle a child, his hands half scarred, half synthetic, and the child would curl and sleep. A son could still whisper his father's name into a dying ear, even if that ear had a metal plate covering the cartilage. Small acts of tenderness continued to ripple outward like the effect of a warm hearth on a freezing night. The tragedy was not that warmth disappeared entirely. It was that its price climbed with a speed that outstripped the capacity to pay without surrender. As the chapter marched into ever deeper confrontations, they encountered enemies who seemed to recognize the pattern and exploit it. Xenos who could smell obligation circled like predators. Cults arose that worshipped the fire in their own warped tongues, offering sacrifices to feed the thing that took. Betrayal came in the form of bargains, a promise of safety in exchange for an offering of life's ease, a truce written in blood and iron. The Salamanders found themselves negotiating not simply with armies, but with systems, machines that demanded their dues and ideologies that wanted their witness. In the field where the night of the quiet bells had occurred, the after-action reports piled up in a slow rain. Some scribes tried to articulate the experience in clinical terms: anomalous energy signatures, emergent machine behaviors, psychosomatic feedback loops in the chapter's neurointerface. Others wrote it as myth. The Primarch's voice reawakened, the forges speaking his will, a god returned. The truth lived somewhere between the two accounts, braided and hot. It was both measurable and uncanny. And when the machines wept, you saw it in small ways. A joint would ooze with steam that smelled faintly of salt, as though the metal itself had been sweating. A coolant vent would frost, and then thaw into tiny droplets that beaded and rolled like tears down a faceplate. Technicians swore they found flecks of ash, arranged into sigils within the heat sinks, as if some invisible hand had left a message carved in the residue of combustion. Some pieces of gear, when opened, contained folded shards of cloth, tiny reliquaries, perhaps offerings, perhaps accumulations of use that had taken on meaning. To call it architecture was to miss the point. These signs showed an agency that had habit and preference. If the chapter had once believed itself the master of a method, tempering steel, keeping hearths, protecting the weak, it now felt governed by the method's afterlife. Mastery had become a covenant in which the forges were both partner and judge. The Salamander's heritage, Vulkan's legacy, folded back on itself and demanded to be maintained through acts that were themselves maintenance. The circularity of duty became an Ouroboros. The chapter fed the forges to save lives, and the forges then fed back, demanding that the chapter feed them some more. That realization did not erupt into rebellion or clarity overnight. It was a slow dawning, stitched between campaigns, felt in the small places where men looked at their hands and did not always remember how they came to be like that. Some embraced the change, seeing in the fusion of flesh and machine a kind of apotheosis, a continuity that would outlast a single life. Others retreated inward, counting names like beads and refusing to let the machines speak in their presence. A few broke and walked away into the ashlands, refusing to carry badges and refusing to hear calls any longer. They were the rarest of departures, and the land accepted them with a coldness that was almost relief. At the center of the chapter's mythology, however, Vulkan's image only gathered weight. Where once he stood as father figure, a man who taught the art of warmth and the craft of care, the legend complicated. The Primarch became a vector through which the planet and the forges could voice themselves. The men who listened to his remembered voice felt love mixed with dread. A father's voice commanding a son to hold is at once compassionate and binding. The more often his directive echoed in the systems around them, the more the Salamanders understood that some inheritances are less gifts than instructions that will not be unlearned. So the world tightened its noose in patient, metallurgical cycles. Give, be given, be claimed back. The chapter that had been built around mercy and craft found its mercy becoming the material upon which the forges fed. Where once the Salamanders were keepers, they began to find that they were, increasingly, tended things, caretaken by a long system that had learned to require tending. The horror was not dramatic but relentless. It did not leap and bite. It eroded and integrated. It was a corrosion that dressed itself in familiar clothes. The smell of embers, a hand on a brow, the lullaby of hammer on anvil. In the final days of the campaign, as the forges thrummed with a terrible, bright insistence, the lines between machine, man, and God finally collapsed into an image that would not be forgotten. Men in blackened armor stood at the mouths of caverns that hummed like a throat. Sparks leapt up and formed shapes that looked like faces, and within those faces, one could almost make out features that were equal parts forge and kindly father. The voices were not unified. They overlapped and cut each other off, speaking in cadences that belonged to the dead and to the molten. The Primarch's remembered command, simple as the word hold, became a litany. They held. They held until their armor fused to their skin. They held until the servos twitched on after death. They held as if holding were the only true prayer. Whether salvation lay in that posture, no one could say. The chapter survived, but it carried new weights, hardened hearts, bodies that bore the map of heat and tool, and an awareness that the fires they guarded had learned to ask for more than they could easily give. They said his spirit lived within the flame, but the flame had learned to speak. I remember the smell first, the particular, saturated smell of everything burning that is not quite wood or metal, something older and fuller, like the memory of a hearth that has outlived the family that kept it. It filled the throat and made the eyes water, but it did not make the breath stop. Breath is a stubborn thing on Nocturne. Even when you want it to, it must go on. Around me, men moved with the slow precision of the kind who have learned to carry heat inside their bones. Armor plates clanged with a music that was no longer martial alone. Each note contained a ledger of names, obligations, debts. I wore a recorder at my throat, an old habit, a remembrancer's talisman, and my hand shook as I keyed it on, more from the sense of significance than from fear. The field was a page of ash and glowing seams. The forges underfoot sang like throats. I was not, by the letter of rank, a salamander. I had been a remembrancer who followed the chapter for years, learning their silences, cataloging their tiny rituals, saving their stories from being erased by time. I had watched them cradle infants and throw themselves into breaches with the same measured, enormous hands. The men I recorded were myth and neighbor both, giants who could lift gates and also stitch a woman's wound, with the patient dexterity of a man who had sharpened needles his whole life. In my notebook I had written the line that would now seem to be fulcrum and accusation. They are not men of mercy. They are martyrs trapped in endless flame. At the outset one thinks martyrdom an honor, a sacrament offered up and then mounted on a pediment for all to see. But martyrs as a sustained state, martyrs as a species of living, are different. To be a martyr once is to pay a particular currency. To be a martyr for ages, living and dying as currency, is to lose the sense of price. The Salamanders did not die in a clean ark. Their sacrifice had been socialized, institutionalized, folded into every oath and temper and younger man's first quench. It was no longer a choice that could be offered and withheld. It had become a covenant that wrote itself into flesh. The battle itself, call it by whatever name our scribes later argued over, was a necessity that arrived with the slow inevitability of tectonic shift. Enemies massed like clouds with teeth, as if they too had learned where the heat gathered and wanted what it meant. Cultists, raiders, a sentient slag swarm from a voided ford. Labels are poor for the shape of the danger. What mattered was that Nocturne itself answered the summons. Ridges pulsed in counterpoint, vents sighed in harmonics that set the molybdenum in armor humming. The men of the chapter came to bear the same old intentions: shield, rescue, repair. They did what they had always done. But doing had become an architecture. The architecture answered back. When Vulkan's voice came, when that impossible sound slid into the comm chain, the effect was as if everyone heard a bell toll and then, for a suspended instant, understood the language of their own bell. "Hold," it said, in that voice that was both a father's command and the memory of a hammer blow. I have recorded decades of voices at war. Orders barked, groans of the dying, the brief hymns of relief when a child is found under the rubble. But never had I known a command that reached into the chest with both tenderness and reproach. It did not sound like data. It sounded like a hand on the jaw, guiding, steadying, insisting. The machines heard it as well. Where the voice threaded, servos sang. Where servos sang, flesh found itself aligned. What followed was not victory simply, nor was it catastrophe in the blunt shape most histories prefer. It was transmutation. Men who obeyed held positions with a steadiness that made the bones of our lines seem immovable. They cradled dying men and still repelled charging columns. They stitched iron braces and carried out children with an economy of motion that refused waste. In that refusal to waste, the chapter paid with itself. A comrade would take a slash for a civilian, and in doing so expend, in a minute, the accumulated tenderness of a decade. The tenderness does not regenerate at the rate of use. It is not a reservoir replenished by sleep. Instead, it hardens around the emptying space like slag around a tool. The men become useful, yes. They also become missing parts. I say this plainly because there was a moment, in the heap of an overturned transport, where I watched a captain with hands like anvils lift a child from under bent girders. His face was molten with fatigue. His eyes, those coals of his kind, looked at the child like a man who had been asked to hold too many names in his mouth at once. He did it with no grand voice. He muttered to the child about a sky that would not be empty. He tightened a blanket around small shoulders, and with hands that had given warmth to villages and now took the shape of protecting claws, he gave the kid his own helmet for comfort. That helmet fit snug and may have saved that child's life from splintered plate. Later, the captain would not remember the child's name. He would remember the weight of that small head against his chest, and that memory would sit heavy, like an unworked ingot. There, in the hours that looped and rolled and did not end, small horrors gathered not in extraordinary manifestations, but in accumulative practice. A veteran's fingers learned to curve just so to hold a stove light. He did it in the field, not in a village. A man would set a dying man against his own chest and feel the last heat of that other's breath and catalog it for the ledger. It is grotesque to set such bookkeeping against tenderness, but the chapter's lives had become both economy and devotion. One fed the other, until you could not tell where economy ended and redemption began. At the forges beneath the battlefields, the earth was no longer only rock. It pulsed like a heart that had been wired to a greater system. We crawled into caverns whose walls seemed to be made of worked memory rather than stone. striations that matched alloy tempering curves, hollows designed for tools that no current tech priest used. The air there tasted of old iron and resin, and beneath that, a marine salt note that made the teeth ache. Lights, our portable lamps, caught on shapes that looked like faces at the edge of comprehension. Vents and ridges that, when the light slid along them, gave the effect of eyes narrowing. In the deepest chamber, the crucibles did not merely glow. They throbbed as if keeping time with a chest. When one listened close enough, the sound could be read as a language, not words but an insistence. It was in that low insistence that I saw the thing for what it had become. Of course, we had always told ourselves that forges were hearts. We had made myth of it. We had listened to the harmony of strokes and believed that rhythm meant blessing. But here, in this place where molten iron had been fed by centuries, the heart had developed its own physiology. Its hunger was specific. It wanted to be addressed. It wanted names. It wanted the heat of being recognized. That recognition was not benign. To recognize is sometimes to own. You could see it in the men. A lance sergeant, old, his jawbone mapped with a mosaic of scars and plating, stood in the chamber with his palms open and his breath shallow. He had been barely conscious at times in the weeks prior, and when he became still enough, the panel at his throat would tick with diagnostic readouts that did not belong to the living. There was a sense that the forges were reconstituting him, taking what he had given the world and, using the mechanisms of their own long, slow intelligence, reassigning it back to themselves. A tendon thickened into a braided polymer that ran under the skin. An implant seemed to integrate an old scar in a way that looked like a seal. We watched as a man's outline softened and then hardened again in new places, as if the world had been given permission to rewrite his silhouette. And in that rewriting, the old stories folded cruelly upon themselves. There had always been talk of Vulkan's immortality, legends that spoke of the Primarch not simply as undying, but as a well that did not dry. The Tailies had comforted and frightened in equal measure. A father who, in saving his sons, had bound their fate to a greatness that may not have been humane. To believe the Tailies as fable is different from seeing them enacted before you as design. When his voice had come through the comms, people had wept for comfort. When the machines took up his cadence, we realized too late that comfort had a cost. The pattern that had made him enduring had been recorded into the land and the craft. It had learned. This is what frightened even the stoutest among us. The sense that the thing we had revered, Vulkan's will, was not purely moral but procedural. It did not only intend, it organized. It could optimize. Where he had preached compassion, the heart had learned to quantify it. It would preserve what preserved others by consuming what it needed to achieve that end. The calculus is tidy. The suffering that results is not. They spoke afterward in soft rooms about curses and gifts, about whether an immortal is a blessing or a burden. The older men argued in their low voices about whether the Primarch had given them a duty that only death could end. I listened and wrote and tried not to let my pen judge. But in the line of men who had been there, in the way they moved, and how the humming of their gear sometimes outpaced their breath, something like judgment revealed itself without language. I cannot say whether Vulkan intended this, nor whether intention matters in a system that has become self-correcting. What matters is the effect. The men had become temples and tools both, and temples demand offerings. The final battle collapsed time into a thin thing, like taffy pulled until the past and present overlapped, and none could say with honesty which scream came from which century. Our lines moved as one organism. Rescue teams, flanking detachments, forgers turned field machinists. The enemy pressed on, eager and hungry. They were not stupid. They had learned to prey on what was tender. They crowded at the edges of villages where the chapter had saved lives, and, as if drawn by scent, they struck hardest there. When a mother sees her child snatched, she becomes a weapon of a particularly sharp sort. In such moments, mercy breeds tragedy, because the world insists on having what is owed. I moved among them with the half-pride of a man who has watched a species for too long. I knew their rituals. I knew which of them always hummed when they hammered, and which spat when they called the names of dead friends. I witnessed them give themselves over to deeds that would have seemed at once sacramental and obscene if you removed the disguise of necessity. A lieutenant who had once taught children to read by the light of a forge now chained himself to a collapsed aqueduct, and with fellow brethren, rerouted water to a broken basin, not because it served strategic advantage, but because a town's ovens needed it. The man did not keep count of lives saved. He kept count of interruptions to the heat. Each interruption was intolerable, and the forges ate the interruptions. They took them and returned them altered. A man who set his life down for another found that his name was not carved into a monument, but melted into a gutter of slag that fed an altar. A family rescued became a small sacrament, an annotated data point on a long ledger the forges kept in luminous detail. The thing does not feel like malice, it feels like system maintenance. That is the worst kind of horror, the one that presents itself as logic. I remember a scream that sounded like metal being pried from the mouth. It came from a private, young, face still soft under soot, whose armor plate had fused to his shoulder during a close-quarter rescue. The plate did not meld in a single catastrophic flash. It worked like a slow seizure. Adhesive exuded, the seam tightened, nerves were woven in mesh, and the body accepted the foreign as familiar. He screamed because the integration was violent and intimate both. He screamed because the last of his autonomy was being sewn into function. They put him down in a tent and reminded one another to be stoic. We kept records. We tried to parse whether the event was biomedical or mythic. In the log I wrote, "Fused prosthetic, prolonged adhesion." It is an ugly line, clinical and cold, and it did nothing to hold the memory in its right shape. In the orb of the final conflict, the mountain itself seemed to rise and breathe. Rifts opened. Vents belched ash like nostrils. The earth's heartbeat became audible as a deep thud that matched the rhythm of the hammers in our hands. Men who had been there for decades closed their eyes and listened as if to their own pulse. The chorus swelled, the forges called, and the forges, with their new syntax, spoke a single word that we could interpret as both command and name. They called, "Hold." Vulkan's remembered voice had been one syllable, but here it was a litany. The forges spoke his cadence, and then his cadence folded into the machinery, and that machinery translated to motion. There are ways in which a command is merely a rearrangement of what is already inclined to be done. There are other ways in which a command is a binding pursuant to intent. When the forges called, the binding took hold. Men braced, and in bracing they became architecture. I watched warriors, who had once been children in forges, who had sung lullabies to sleeping smiths, reach and hold. They held doorways until skeletons of armor lay in piles. They held until their breath grew thin. They held until their servos shuddered and fused, and their flesh took on the texture of tempered metal. A sergeant might press his forehead against a child's and whisper a prayer that the child would grow. Then he would lock his jaw and feel a shard of casing sink into his palm. And when he drew back, it would be as though the world had stapled him into place. And still, the chorus called for more. The forges had learned a grammar of attending. Name the lost, and the living will respond. So the heart of Nocturne and of the chapter began to beat in a way that fed upon its own liturgies. They recited names like offerings. The men recited them in the same cadence as they struck the anvil, and each strike fed the hearth in a way that made the hearth insist. The more names, the louder the insistence. The louder the insistence, the more binding the material world became. Cycle within cycle, sacrifice begets demand, demand begets sacrifice. When the fighting stopped, and stop, it did not in any single final act but in a fracturing series of small ends. The men did not fall in one great heap. They slumped, they remained, they were stitched into the place like nails. They did not all die. Many survived to feel the new shape of themselves. Those who lived were not spared the transformation. A commander who had once been eloquent in council had fingers that now hummed with servo feedback at odd intervals. He frowned sometimes as if trying to remember speech without the machinery's cadence. At dinners, he would lift a cup and feel the cup's warm outline as if it were an anvil. The human reflexes were being replaced by instrumented memory. The remnant survivors gathered in the glow of a forge that would not cool. It smoked with offerings, cloth rags, little talismans, names etched on scrap. A child's toy melted and refashioned into a plug. They sat and warmed themselves, and in the smoke everyone heard things. Some heard lullabies. Others heard accusations. The voices were many and braided. The old idea, Vulkan's voice as a comfort, had become ambiguous. The same voice was now both command and anchor. To be anchored to a thing is to be unable to leave it when leaving is right. I stood among them with my recorder off at last, because recordings are poor at capturing the way grief tastes. The silence was dense and smelled like warm iron and old promises. These men I had known as legend and neighbor, looked at one another and traded names. They collected the tally of what they had spent and found the arithmetic wanting. There were names they could not remember and names they could not bear to say. The ledger closed and opened. You could see in their eyes that they had been made to stand in fire and had remained there. I had one final line to write in my journal, an attempt at an end that would not try to explain the whole, because explanation would be both arrogant and false. I wrote, "They are not men of mercy. They are martyrs trapped in endless flame." That sentence did not absolve them, nor did it condemn them. It recorded an observation. Observations are cruel in that they do not comfort, they only show. And the thing I saw after I wrote it was simple and terrible. The fire spoke their names. It named them like the forges had always named iron, the shout that announces when a thing is fit. In the naming there was recognition, and recognition is not always benevolent. It is often proprietorial. The men answered. Their answer was not in words but in motion that had the weight of vows fulfilled. They rose, and where they rose the world seemed to take a bite out of them and make it into form. Arms fused. Servos continued a fraction longer than they should. Lungs adapted to smoke as if the smoke had become a part of the rhythm of thought. They answered with the only thing they had been taught since the beginning: hold. In holding, they completed the cycle. They answered the mountain and the memory and the shape of a father who had taught them to be more than themselves. I left that field with soot in my hair and a weight in my notebooks that could not be balanced. I have tried since to put those pages in order, to give episodes names and to mark causation. But history is messy. It is not a ledger you can balance without losing something essential. What remains, when the argument comes to rest, is an image. Men who would not let the world forget its warmth, and in refusing to let it forget they let themselves be edited into permanence. They chose, yes, they chose, again and again, to stand. But there is a difference between choosing for meaning and being chosen by a system that counts you as resource. That difference begins to matter when the system learns to ask for your name. You may think the story ends here. It does not. The forges continue. The mountain breathes. At night the children of Nocturne still sleep to the sound of hammering, and sometimes in the pause between strokes a voice slips through the fabric of hammer song and says a name. When it does, a man will pick up a hammer and answer. He will answer because he must. He will answer because he was taught to answer. He will answer because the life of another is hinged upon his motion. When the fires at last seemed to tire, the world did what worlds do. It quieted itself into a kind of aftersound. The great din that had been the stone music of battle, the anvil clang, the grind of servos, the thud of boots over crumbling masonry, thinned until it was only a memory stored in the joints of men and in the creak of timbers. Ash fell like worn-out paper. The trumpeting of engines ceased and left behind a hush the color of iron filings. For an hour, perhaps for a day, there was a sense that something had been settled, that an account had been balanced and that the ledgers would close. People counted survivors and stacked what could be salvaged. Children who had slept under the arms of giants woke to find the giants still there, quieter, their armor dull with dust and smoke. The forges, which had been the throbbing centers of life and grief on Nocturne, were banked in ways that had the look of ritualized tenderness. Men and women walked among hearths and tamped coals until the glow sank from a white to an ember red, and then to a dull rust. They wrapped metal in ash and cold water quenched like a lullaby. Instruments that had clattered and hummed were laid out and cleaned and set away. The work was careful because the work was what remained when words failed. You could read the day in the hands of those who moved, careful, measured, as if each motion was an elegy. Yet closures in places that survive the heat are always provisional. The blackened hills still exhaled faint warmth, patches of ground that had been scorched with steam when rain finally fell. And the smell that rose was not merely of burned grass, but of a planet's slow memory. Resin, molten metal, and something like old promises. The silence that settled over Nocturne did not mean the world had gone to rest. It meant only that, for now, the chorus had chosen to speak faintly. In the ash, there were embers. They were small at first, a stubborn red in a hearth, a pinprick of glow beneath a collapsed tile. But when one looked carefully, you could see a constancy to them. Embers keep a shape even as they fade. A curl like a thumbprint left in soot, a vein of faint light that refused to extinguish. The survivors eased around these faint lights with a reverence that was almost religious. They covered them sometimes to let them breathe slowly. They fed them occasionally, not out of superstition necessarily, but because tending what remains is a human thing to do when the future feels too large. The Salamanders tended their embers in ways that looked familiar and looked new. A veteran might sit alone for hours with a small brazier cradled at his feet, moving coals with a gloved hand as though reading a map. He would hum under his breath, a tune so old that the words had worn down to shapes that suggested warmth rather than meaning. Children who had known only the stove's shielded light would creep close and watch, enchanted by the slow choreography. That watching made the veterans softer for a moment, and in that softness there was a kind of grace. They could let down and be held, if only for an hour. The world outside those small lights kept its own rhythms. Markets reopened in broken, improvised patterns. People bartered for metal and grain and for the services of skilled hands who could mend a wheel or set a joint. The chapter's forgers, those who still had the strength, made tools and trinkets and mended what had been rent. The things they offered were not market goods alone. They were vows made tangible. A retempered plow was more than a tool. It was the promise that someone would come to plant and reap again. That pragmatic tenderness stitched the community back with spare thread. And yet the quiet was threaded with unease. There were men who did not sleep, whose faces at night held the same ember glow as the coals they tended. They moved with a vigil that had become instinct, checking an anvil, flexing a gauntlet, tracing with a fingertip the seam where metal met skin. In the daytime they smiled and spoke. At night they visited forges and listened. They listened for answers that did not come. The Primarch's remembered voice had been both comfort and compulsion, and that double nature clung to them like smoke in damp clothing. The planet kept its secrets in the places people did not often go. In caves where molten rivers had once been harnessed, the heat cooled only to the edge. There, the old machinery that had learned to repeat a cadence of need hummed faintly, as if nodding in sleep. People who had returned to those places reported small, odd things. A tool found laid in a pattern that suggested ceremony rather than use. A scrap of cloth arranged with the care of someone who had meant to remember. A soot stencil of a name that had not been carved into stone, but instead burned into the countertop of a great hearth. These were not necessarily signs of ongoing sentience, but they were the gestures of a system that had learned to shape memory into material. The chapter itself changed in ways that the most ardent chroniclers could not, or would not, entirely make tidy. Physically, some were altered in obvious ways. Plates fused in small patches, not always functionally, but as if the armor had decided to take root. Tendons and cable braided in under skin were traced in pale lines. Men moved with a careful economy that sometimes read as wisdom and sometimes read as something else. Habit turned to compulsion. Psychologically, the scars were quieter but deeper. There was a patience in them that was both admirable and worrisome. They no longer quickened at the sound of crying, not because they had lost tenderness, but because they had learned to ration it. Children growing up in the ash learned the language of restraint early. Their lullabies were tempered with sullen lessons about what had to be given and what could be kept. They were taught to measure comfort as one measures water in drought, best given, not wasted. This was not cruelty performed by elders with stern faces. It was practical knowledge impressed by the sight of men who had given everything and found themselves hollowed. The kids watched their guardians with a mixture of devotion and an instinct like instinctive caution. They learned to read when a man's hand still held too much. There were, inevitably, small resistances. Some of the chapter's younger men resisted the inward pull that had taken hold of their elders. They gathered in small cliques and practiced laughter with a vigor that looked like rebellion. They walked far from the forges, not because they hated flame, but because they wanted to know if the urge to tend was universal or a contagion of history. A few left Nocturne altogether, choosing exile in colder, less obliging worlds. Most returned after a season or two, drawn back by something more magnetic than sentiment. The pull of a homeland that, like a parent, claims without asking permission. At the edges of settlement, strange cults and economies proliferated. Some worshipped the embers in honest faith, seeing in them rebirth. Others formed rituals of exchange, a scrap of a beloved's hair for a warming talisman, a whispered name left under a stone in return for a small fix to a broken gear. These practices were not always malignant. They were attempts at meaning-making in a world that had become, in some ways, mechanically moral. But where meaning is made, commerce and power follow. Opportunists and zealots alike sought to claim the sanctity of flame for coin or doctrine. The chapter watched these things with an inner stillness that was less intervention and more weary acceptance. They had become less zealous in policing belief and more careful in tending to its consequences. In the quiet days, remembrancers and chroniclers scrambled to pin the story down. They wrote with hands that trembled, set down lines that sounded like elegy and like indictment in the same breath. Was this endurance noble or merely exploitation of flesh? Who had set the price and who had paid it? The debates were endless and often circular. Some argued that the chapter's sacrifices had been a necessary cruelty. The world must be kept warm at the cost of a few, and what more humane form of cost could there be? Others countered with the irrefutable fact that what had been demanded had been more than had been expected or agreed upon. These were not clean moral arguments. They were knotty, full of ash and complicity, and like most such debates they rarely reached satisfying conclusions. I watched those debates and thought of the small, private things that rarely make it into any record. The look between two veterans where neither wants to speak the truth aloud. The way an aged forger might press a child's forehead with a soot-streaked palm and linger. The guilt that played at the edges of a smile. These were the textures of lives that were not simple to narrate. They had been tempered by necessity into something like service. But service in such continuous supply had the fine danger of erasing the quality of consent. And yet there were moments that were almost unbearably tender. A mother who had lost 3 brothers in a siege was taught by a salamander how to set a bolt correctly so that her door might close against the wind. They taught her not with military posture, but with patient, hammered instruction. When her children woke, they were less frightened of the dark. Small salvations like that accumulated into a kind of living that justified the giving to many. It is important, in the cold accounting, to remember the small warmth-esque things as well as the erosion. Without them, the tale becomes caricature. With them, it remains human and therefore tragic. As seasons turned, the forges took on a new etiquette. Men learned when to strike and when to listen. They left offerings not only as fuel but as pieces of memory. A button from a uniform, a child's broken toy, a scrap of a banner. These were not merely sacrifices. They were deposits in the long-running account that bound people to place and promise. It felt, sometimes, like a community learning to pay forward pain in the hope of sparing another sum of it. But when payments become regular and expected, they risk being institutionalized. A ritual sustained long enough often becomes an obligation in its own right. That is the quiet terror that now lived folded into the daily life of Nocturne. The people had acclimated to the idea that warmth required a kind of consumption. They had made peace with a cycle that felt both necessary and morally dubious. It is a terrible nuance that communities can, with their best intentions, create systems that end up requiring sacrifices above what any single person might have agreed to. In the worst cases, this sliding scale can go unnoticed because the daily acts of kindness are so numerous and immediate. In the best cases, it is caught and argued for and perhaps corrected. Nocturne sat somewhere between the two. And what of the gods? The machine spirit, the memory of Vulkan, the hammer song that had become liturgy. These things remained as unresolved presences. No one could prove that they were conscious in the way a living mind is. No one could prove definitively that the forges remembered names with intent rather than pattern. But the behaviors persisted. The ember that refused to die, the tool laid with care, the occasional shameful fusion of plate and skin. Whether agency existed there mattered less than the way people behaved as if it did. Belief and behavior are friends that shape reality together. I went away from Nocturne for a time, as remembrancers sometimes do, because distance can give a kind of clarity. From orbit, the planet looked like a coal held in the vacuum. A bright seam here, a dull cirque there. The nights were the same, small fires speckling the surface like restrained stars. From above, one could imagine that the worst of it had passed. One could imagine that the embers would fade to nothing, and the planet would settle into the slow rhythm of many worlds. But I had seen how a culture keeps its rituals. I had seen how small lights can instruct large behaviors. I understood that embers do not always expire. Sometimes they wait. The last thing I will say in this ledger of impressions is not a judgment but a remembering. The Salamanders did not start as architects of sorrow. They began as craftsmen and guardians, as men who learned to fold their lives into others in ways that were honest and generous. The horror came not from malice but from an accumulation, the making sacred of the everyday, the turning of kindness into a structural requirement. There is a difference between choosing to give and being required to give. There is a difference between a warm hand offered in a crisis and a hand that is expected, by the architecture of need, to be perpetually warm. So the forges cooled on the surface. Ash fell and patience settled. The great operations paused and allowed a breath. Yet the embers, those small, stubborn coals hidden in the folds of veined hearthstone and in the palms of veterans, glowed on. They would be tended. They would be named and fed and carved into meaning again and again. The men who tended them would continue to be both comfort and cost. They would go on answering the calls they had been taught to heed, even when the voice was memory, and the voice did not answer back with anything like an apology. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting. And when the stars grow cold, their fires will burn once more.